Vulnerable Minds is a really interesting book. I just want to start off by saying that. And it
Thank you.
all it's it's almost a prequel to Evolutious, which is also a really interesting book, and it gives you an insight into human psyche. But Vulnerable Minds in particular, that book's really interesting to me because back in college, I wrote an essay, and I talked about how a kid's nutrition really affects their cognitive process, and it affects their life basically for the rest of their life. And what I realized while reading that book was that there's so many more factors, which nutrition might be one of them, but there's so many different factors. And there's this other book that I read as well called "The Body Keeps the Score." I think that's the title of the
Hmm.
book, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So something about that book and something about Vulnerable Minds is that there's always trauma that's hidden in our childhood, and sometimes we don't even remember what the trauma is, but it still exists. But talk to me a little bit more about the influence that you had about writing this book, and what inspired you to write it, first of all.
Yeah. I mean, the main inspiration was really working directly for the past 16 or so years with children in special education. So, for the last 16 years, following up on the career I had in research, which continues, but is working with children with different disabilities. And for some of those children, many of them, part of the disability is in some ways due to adverse childhood experiences or maltreatment. Children who have been severely neglected, abused, exposed to domestic violence, parent loss, and so forth. And as a result of those adversities, they ultimately what's happened is that it's left a scar to the body and brain, and
Hmm.
that's effectively what trauma is. So trauma is the response to adverse experience, and it comes from the Greek word to scar. And so
Right.
what trauma really is a scarring to the body and the brain. The motivation was in some ways seeing all these children and working with these children with those experiences, but also realizing that there was this huge amount of scientific research that was really not accessible or available to either teachers or clinicians working with such children,
Hmm.
or parents of, or sufferers themselves.
Right.
And in some ways, a book like The Body Keeps the Score, that was a very important book in the sense that it really did two things. One is it brought to the public's attention how the body can be scarred
Hmm.
by traumatic events. Um, uh, and secondly, linking that to the scientific evidence, which Bessel van der Kolk, the author, did. The main focus of that book was in some ways adults.
Hmm.
It's adults living with the history of childhood maltreatment. And so for me, there was an opportunity to talk about children,
Yeah.
which is why I wrote the book, is that there was a kind of a gap, not as if there was no books on childhood, but
Hmm.
that bringing things up to date with the kind of the perspective and model that I lay out in the book seemed like a real opportunity to really help people who currently suffer, including children, as well as parents of children,
Yeah.
to be able to not only understand the symptoms of these traumatic signatures, but also to understand ways in building resilience and recovery from the trauma.
Right. So, is there anything you could do to repair those scars, or are those scars just with you forever?
No, there are, and there are many. There, I think so. So one important distinction here, and this, is an important part of the book, is that in some ways, it's less helpful to talk about trauma than what I describe in the book as traumatic signatures, and that's
Hmm.
because the nature of the adverse experiences, including the type of adversity, the timing of that adversity, what I call tenure, how long it lasts,
Yeah.
toxicity, the severity, and turbulence, which is kind of the predictability or controllability of it, what I call the five adverse T's. Those different dimensions of adversity shape what the symptoms look like. And in order to be helpful, it's important to recognize those signatures because that guides what can be done. So let me just kind of give an
Hmm.
example to make it simple. Um, Children that have been neglected, severely neglected, show different kinds of traumatic symptoms than do children that have been abused.
Right.
Children who have been neglected typically, again, these are, kind of broad conclusions, but typically show deficits in what's often called the executive system, the
Hmm.
systems that are involved in attention, self-regulation, planning, flexibility, uh, emotional regulation.
Hmm.
Those systems, in some ways, are undermined by neglect to a large extent because when that neglect happened early in life, for the first few years of life, that's when critical experiences must take place for the areas of the brain to develop and allow for those functions to be mature. So when that doesn't happen, and an example I give in my book is our youngest daughter, who now is 25, but who grew up in an orphanage in Eastern Europe and was severely neglected for the first couple of years of her life.
Hmm.
And those kinds of deficits really show up in terms of, in some ways, not being able to be ready for learning in a school environment, for example. And so there can then be targeted interventions to help children better, remember things, short-term memory, to better attend, to learn by association. So there are all sorts of strategies that can help those children catch up.
Hmm.
Needless to say, like almost any developmental phenomenon, the longer the neglect occurs and the older that child is living with neglect, the harder it is to recover some of those processes. And that's why, for example, in Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps a Score, and many, many other, very, very important books in this field,
Hmm.
they're often focusing on adults who are living with childhood trauma because it's never been dealt with. It's never been addressed. Okay, so that's one side.
Right.
The abuse side is different. And just in brief, what abuse tends to do is it sets this important area for kind of emotional processing, the amygdala. It sets it on high alert. So
Yeah.
children with abuse history will be constantly vigilant. They're on alert. They're looking for the next threat, and they have a hard time calming their nervous system. And so
Hmm.
again, there are different strategies for that. But the bottom line is that, um, especially when these adversities and the trauma that's shown are identified and seen early, and therefore the interventions can start, when magic can occur and these children can recover from that history.
So, how good does therapy actually work? Does it work? Do you think?
Well, for sure. So I think, one of the concepts in the book, and again, this is not novel to me, but I kind of, use it in a broad way, is that because of individual differences, and in part the individual's differences that are due to those key dimensions, timing, toxicity, tenure, and so forth, um, that what that means is that not one approach is going to necessarily work for everyone. So
Right.
therapy can be very, very effective for some, but not all. There are other approaches that can be done either with therapy or without. In some cases, it's medication. A child who is very, very significantly emotionally dysregulated, let's say due to a history of abuse, they'll often need medication to calm the nervous system so that other types of approaches can be helpful. The last part of the book focuses on, in some ways, some of the newer approaches. So I speak a little bit about the kind of revolution that's been happening over the last decade in the psychedelics area of
Hmm.
using psychedelic, so therapy assisted psychedelics, things like ketamine, psilocybin, MDMA, and so forth for different kinds of mental health issues. Those are maturing sciences. So obviously they've not in some ways been yet FDA approved,
Right.
but they're moving in that direction. And the critical piece about that, which kind of goes back to your first question, is that for some classic approaches to trauma, PTSD, for example, of therapy, and certain kinds of traditional medications, serotonergic medications, have not worked. They are what are called treatment resistant populations.
Yeah.
And here in those cases, some of these psychedelic therapy approaches have proven to be very effective.
Hmm.
There are other techniques, for example, that I discuss in the book. Um, One called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. And this is where a magnetic coil is
Hmm.
applied to a certain part of the brain. It's like a clicking effect. And the function of that type of approach is it effectively deactivates certain brain areas temporarily. It's like causing a temporary lesion, which can basically break that circuit apart. So I'll just give you kind of one kind of really powerful example that I discuss in the book. Um, for some people with traumatic responses, the adverse experience they had was very visually salient. Seeing a loved one, killed by a car, a friend in war being shot, right? Something that's got a very powerful visual connection.
Right.
And what happens in those situations is that those individuals will often suffer from night tremors. They'll have very, very significant visual nightmares. They'll have intrusions of visual imagery that make them basically non functional. So it completely undermines their daily functioning because they're constantly kind of reminded of these very visual, powerful inputs.
Hmm.
So under TMS, we know very well from, probably at this point, 40 years of research in visual imagery, we know exactly where in the brain visual imagery occurs. And so if I put you in the scanner and I say, okay, Erik, I want you to think about, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to imagine what your living room looks like. Okay.
Hmm.
There are two key areas that light up. One is the visual imagery area, and the second is what's called the parietal, which is kind of an attentional space area. So you put people in the scanner, you identify where their visual imagery area is, and now you actually invite them to relive that traumatic event or the traumatic
Hmm.
events. So that imagery is coming back up. And while they're doing that, this magnetic coil is effectively breaking apart that image. Here's what
Right.
happens:
Hmm.
those people don't lose the memory that that experience occurred, but the visual input is now dissipated. It's effectively erased.
Hmm.
And so for that, that makes their experience much more manageable because they're not getting hit by these visual images that are absolutely incapacitating for many.
Yeah. And so I want to get also into your book Evolutions in a little bit, but what is the bridge between a neglected childhood and crime? Is there a correlation there?
Neglect and crime? No. There's not really a connection on neglect, except in the case, of course. And so I think you're aware that I kind of run a nonprofit in Africa called International Children's Aid Network,
Hmm.
and for many children, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, there's a very, very large orphan population. There's something like 55 million orphans in sub-Saharan Africa, staggering kind of number. Now, of course, for many of these children, because of neglect, they had to lead a life in the streets where, of course, theft is going to occur because they are starving, they have no shelter, and those things are going to be linked correlatively,
Yeah.
right? They're in survival mode. What I would be careful of here is that there's no causal connection between neglect and crime,
Mm.
but there are certainly going to be some associations. Children living in abject poverty, which of course is a form of neglect. You mentioned at the beginning
Right.
your essay on nutrition. A child who's been neglected due to living in abject poverty, which of course the populations that we're working with in Africa, that's an example of.
Right.
Crime may come next just because they're trying to find food.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the kids I work with, let's say in Kenya, we are working with children who are in juvenile detention centers because they've stolen.
Yeah.
And they've stolen as a way of surviving. So I mean, it's a survival. It's an adaptive response in
Mm-hmm.
many ways. So there are those correlations. In the same way that a child who has been physically abused or sexually abused,
Right.
that may show up as aggression, right? And that may be then linked to a crime, right? So there may be battery because they're so emotionally dysregulated due to the abuse, they just can't tamp down the emotions. So
Mm-hmm.
what I would say is that childhood maltreatment can be associated with crime, but the causality is what we have to be very careful of. The association are often either adaptive responses or really a symptom of what's happening to the nervous system.
Right, because something really interesting that I looked at was the races, different races, and their the poverty percentage within that race and the crime percentage between poverty. So an argument that I've heard often is that poverty does not necessarily cause crime, right? But there is a good correlation between the race, their poverty rate, and crime, which poverty may not necessarily in essence cause the crime, but the environment in which those that are living in poverty may cause, certain factors to make that population live in crime, basically.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, socioeconomic status, which is often kind of a metric of, kind of, financial well-being and well-being more generally. You often, of course, find those pockets where low socioeconomic areas are often associated with higher crime rates. But then again, we really want to understand the causes here and the
Mm-hmm.
mechanisms that lead it, and what can change. And so, one thing of interest here is, again, this a study studied in my book is they looked at, I think this was African American individuals in, I think it was in the Chicago area, where they looked at the relationship between self-control or self-regulation and kind of various measures of success.
Mm-hmm.
And as has been found in many populations, individuals with higher self-control had greater kind of academic success, wealth success, health success, and so forth. But as an interesting consequence of that, they were also biologically aging earlier. And the
Mm-hmm.
idea here is that if you're living under very difficult, stressful circumstances and you're using self-control to tamp down
Yeah.
kind of your emotions, your behavior, that may have the benefit of greater success on the surface level, but there's a biological cost. You're effectively aging yourself much more rapidly because you're basically keeping all the stress in. And so these move in different ways. And ultimately, what we want to be careful of is that keeping the lid on stress is for many a very, very toxic thing. When we live with long-term stress, it wears the body down.
And that's why children in third world countries may look older than they are, or may actually
That's
be
right. There's
acting,
biological.
right?
That's exactly right. It's aging. It's so when we see, shorter lifespans in countries that are living in under severe stress. I mean, the Middle East, currently Ukraine and Russia. I mean, all these places which are struggling. You know, these are things that are ultimately toxic to the developing body.
Yeah. So now getting into Your book, Evolutions. So, what was the inspiration in writing that book specifically?
Um, I think that was, I mean, in some ways parallel to vulnerable minds in the sense that
Hmm.
there was a growing literature on our understanding of what ultimately is the kind of the foundation to the book, which is desire plus denial
Yeah.
is what leads to kind of evil. And I felt that even though there were other books about the nature of kind of evil and cruelty, they hadn't been anchored in the kind of model that I was looking at. So, for example, Simon Baron-Cohen, the very distinguished developmental psychologist at Cambridge University, wrote a book called I think it was titled like in one version Zero Empathy or something like that, where
Hmm.
um, effectively evil psychopaths have no empathy. And although I think low to no empathy is an important part of it, because empathy ultimately is about perspective taking, that's not a sufficient explanation for evil because, for example, individuals who are autistic
Yeah.
on the autistic spectrum also lack empathy, but the lack of empathy doesn't lead to evil doing. So again, empathy may be an important part of not engaging in evil doing, but it's not sufficient. And so I was looking for something else which had, strong scientific evidence. And I do think the evidence is quite strong that when you are effectively morally whitewashing and
Hmm.
saying there is no moral issue. And so the kind of the example I give is Stengel during World War II was a Nazi concentration camp kind of director. He said, he treated the Jews and the blacks and the gypsies, kind of the unwanted from the Germans' perspective. He treated them as objects. He said, just move the cargo. So once you turn people into non-humans, um, now, well, I can kick a box because a box is a box. It's inanimate. Who cares, right? So once you
Right.
dehumanize, now you've got an ingredient to do effectively evil things. But that has to be tied to desire, right? A desire for certain kinds of things to be true. For him, it was promotions, right? So there's a desire for promotions. When he was first put in the concentration camp as the director, he actually didn't know that it was about basically killing Jews and blacks and gypsies and people with disabilities.
Hmm.
Once he realized that was the job in some sense, now what unfolds is, well, I have a desire for promotion. That's my desire. And in order to do my job, I've got to deny that these people are even human. And now I can get my job done. And so that was the idea, was to put those things. I mean, people, there's thousands of books on, you know, all the evil people in history,
Right.
historical things. But to me, it was trying to find a way to use the science to come up with, in some ways that's kind of written in the book, a kind of a recipe for what leads to that based on the science that we have today, and to write it hopefully in a way that's accessible to the general public. I mean, all the books I've written, I try to do things where I take complicated science and try to put it into relatively simple terms so that anyone can understand, kind of the idea at least.
Yeah, because something also that you talk about in the book is that there is a reward in evil doing, and that's why they do it,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And real quick, so one thing from looking at so many different serial killers and their backstories is that they had a pretty bad upbringing. And the reason that they, or something that they have in common, is that most serial killers get some kind of sexual gratification from doing the killing, which is the reward in itself. So, talk to me a little bit
Hmm.
about that correlation.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I mean, there's a really interesting organization called the Compassion Prison Project, run by a woman named Fritzi Hortzman. And if you haven't seen it, there's an amazing video on YouTube um, called I think it's called the Compassion Circle Project. Anyway, to make a long story short, what she does is she takes people in a max security prison in the
Mm-hmm.
United States, something like 250 prisoners, and she has them form this huge circle outside in the courtyard. And she walks them through the ACEs questionnaire, the Adverse Childhood Experiences
Mm-hmm.
questionnaire. So she says, if you were neglected during childhood, where people did, your parents or caretakers didn't really care about you, didn't show any love, in fact, and take a step into the circle. And she effectively walks through all 10 ACE questions. And by the time she gets to the end of it, all the prisoners are effectively on top of each other. These guys are carrying massive adverse childhood experiences. And what you see in these individuals, and it's just heartbreaking. I've probably seen that video 100 times. Every time I see it, it brings tears to my eyes.
Mm-hmm.
These big, big guys, right? They come together, their heads drop. The shame of what they experienced is extraordinary. And seeing their brothers coming together is ultimately rewarding and therapeutic for them because they realize they were not alone and that these are some of the sources that led them in some ways to what they did. Okay, so that's an important piece because I think it's important here to distinguish between disabilities that are, let's say, neurodevelopmental. For example, autism is due to things that happen early in development, including specifically fetal development, during early cellular development, that result in autism as a disability. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to other kinds of disability, including things like depression, schizophrenia, manic depression, and so forth, as opposed to mental health issues which can arise due to these adverse childhood experiences. Okay. So, one of the things that certain kinds of adverse childhood experiences can result in is it can completely screw up the reward system. Okay. And neglect is an example of that. Severe neglect can mess with the reward system. So, that typical kind of carrots and sticks don't have the effect they do on people who haven't been neglected. And that's critical because that means that the ways in which societies, generally speaking, right, cross-culturally, use punishment when people do things that are not okay, and use rewards when people do things that are good and okay. They want to motivate people. Those traditional methods, which are broadly cross-cultural, don't work for those kind of people. And so that's when you start seeing these misbehaviors like sexual deviance, violence, cruelty, right? They continue. And then for that raises really, really powerful, important, and complicated questions about rehabilitation. How do you rehabilitate or how do you change someone was born with psychopathic tendencies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who are often completely inert when it comes to certain kinds of emotions. They just don't seem to care, right? How do you shift that person into a space? And I think what's really important here is where, we're still in very, very uncertain and unknown territory. But let me make an analogy so that the
Mm-hmm.
listeners can appreciate the distinction. In autism, um, for most autistic people, there is either low or no empathy. And there's also either low or no ability to perspective take, to say, oh, I'm talking with Erik. Erik's got this background. I'm going to put myself in his shoes today. And when I'm talking to him, I'm not going to use high level scientific, terms because that's not who Erik is, nor probably his listeners. So I need to shift my perspective and imagine I'm speaking to people who don't have that background. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
that is not an ability that the autistic mind has. And if you try to teach it, it's like trying to say, I'm going to try to teach an inanimate object to take a perspective taking, right? The
Mm-hmm.
brain is just not built in that way. Again, I'm not saying this in a negative way. I'm saying that the brain is just not built to have that process. It's like saying, I'm going to now teach a mosquito to speak language. Never going to happen. So don't try, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to be equally sensitive to these different disabilities, including what happens under trauma and when it occurred, that some things, at least as far as we know today, may not be changeable. Okay. So the notion of rehabilitation, and this goes back to your earlier question about crime. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
on everybody's mind with criminal behavior is recidivism. Recidivism is very, very high. We ought to be asking ourselves the question, is the recidivism just part of the disability? Because we have not successfully changed these individuals, and we may never because we haven't figured out how. No one, for example, has figured out how to give the autistic individual empathy. That
Mm-hmm.
hasn't happened. Total failure.
Mm-hmm.
Not because people haven't tried, but just not working. So, in cases of sexual predators, serial killers, serial, repeating the offense, right?
Right.
Is there anything meaningful about rehabilitation? And again, in some cases, yes, because of the nature of the disability being plastic, right? That there wasn't a fundamental change that happened in the brain early in development, maybe, and it's a symptom of current environmental circumstances. And if the environment can change, then that individual can change. But in other cases, we have to recognize that some of these things are due to neurodevelopmental developmental processes that are now rigidly unmovable, and
Mm-hmm.
we may not be able to rehabilitate in the way that we'd like of changing completely the perspective.
Right. And the thing about evil people also is that a lot of them just hide in plain sight. And it's not something that you're able to really diagnose or just be able to tell who is evil and who isn't because they like to appear as normal people as well. And is that one of those characteristics as well?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, people, for example, often talk about, people who are narcissistic, manipulative, and they may be very, very good and crafty at doing that, of kind of luring people in and manipulating them to their ends. And when that happens, you may just be one of the susceptible ones for whatever reasons. So, you know, it often, very well may take time to identify, in some ways, the evildoer, because they're doing it so craftily, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are many, many cases like this. I mean, I don't know if people would put Bernie Madoff in the category of evildoer. But I mean, he was obviously doing that for a long time, taking people's money, manipulating them, and to great harm. So people got sucked in of all kinds. I mean, the wonderful writer and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel was one of those people, who
Mm-hmm.
just got sucked into that universe. And in some ways, many, if not all of us, are in some ways vulnerable because we're going to be
Mm-hmm.
seduced by whatever process that person is good at manipulating, right? I mean, they're often very good at finding, your vulnerability and preying on that.
Yeah, but this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I just hope that we're able to do it next time and just go in deeper because I know that we had a limited time to really discuss this, and this is basically something that could just go on a longer time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for coming on.
All right.